Hello, welcome to Learn Plus. My name is Brenda Bailey Hughes. I'll be your moderator for today. It is delightful to see you. For our viewers, as you log in and get set up and settled in, get your water or your coffee, maybe you could put in the chat where you're calling in from today. We always love to see where all of our fellow class learners, participants are dialing in from today, dialing as if we dial anything these days. I'm here in very humid and toasty Bloomington, Indiana, which is in about an hour south of Indianapolis. I live in the Midwest of the United States. And it's toasty here, but nothing like our friends out on the West Coast and in the West who have been having just a remarkable heat wave going on. We have folks in the house from Turkey, a couple of turkeys. Welcome in, United Kingdom, Jamaica, and I'm complaining about the heat. Maybe I should be quiet. LA, there, Natasha's suffering from the heat, I suppose. We have India and Iran in the house, El Salvador, Istanbul, welcome. So glad you're here. Kansas City, Missouri. Actually, I think our guest is coming in from the Kansas City area. So Tracy, friends in the house there. Finland is here. Arkansas is here. So good to see you. We've got more Kansas. I think I'm seeing some fan club for our guests today. We have Brazil, Cincinnati, Ohio. Great. Good to have another Midwesterner here. Libya, Seattle, Mexico, from the east part of Germany. Nigeria is here. So glad to see you. Maryland, Sao Paulo, Brazil, India. Okay. Yeah, just was so good to see all of you. Welcome aboard, everyone. After you enter where you're from, the next question I want you to think about, because our topic today is about listening, and I'm so glad so many of you have tuned in. Tatiana Kolavu and I have an effective listening course in the LinkedIn library, which I think is where many of you may have connected with me originally. We're in some of my LinkedIn courses. And that class we'll have to ask Shelby, our producer backstage, how many listeners it has, but literally millions of listeners have been into that effective listening class. So tons of viewers for that. We know this is a hot topic, a really interesting topic for people, which is so exciting to me. There's a classic article by Marshall Goldsmith, and it's called The Skill That Separates. So he's talking about what makes you different from all of the other talented, smart, hardworking professionals in the world. And his argument is that it's listening. That when we learn this skill, that we can make our conversational partner feel as though they're the only person in the room, even a crowded, loud, busy room in a meeting with lots of people interrupting and talking. If you can make someone feel like they're the only person in the room, that is what he argues is the skill that separates. So as we're talking about listening today, I want you to start by thinking, what situations do you find it most challenging to be a good listener? So maybe you would say, you can just chat this in a few words. When I'm bored, when I'm tired, when I'm hungry, when I'm on information overload. I know when many of us started working remotely and going to lots of remote meetings, we found it much more challenging to listen remotely than to listen in person. Is that you? Where do you find, what situations make it most challenging? Shelby says anytime after 4 p.m. Doesn't matter what she's doing, who she's with, or where she is. If it's after 4, it's hard to listen. Yes, absolutely. When I am stressed, yes, thank you. Tired, good. Or oh, Katie, interesting. When I'm excited, like, oh, I'm so excited. I want to say something, and then I find myself interrupting. That one could be me. I love that one. Yeah. When else do you find it challenging for you to listen? We'd love to see this, and our guest and I today will even play with these a little bit as we think about the particular challenges that you're facing. Many of you, when you're feeling stressed, that is interesting. And probably our mind is swirling with all of the anxiety and the stress, and it's just so hard to calm that to calm our mind when we're stressed enough to be really good listeners. When I don't like my opponent. Interesting. When I'm multitasking, Mohammed, there is actually a ton of research to support you that none of us are good multitaskers. We like to believe that we are, but none of us are as good at it as we think. And so definitely when we're trying to multitask and listen, we're probably not listening as well as we could when we're distracted or thinking about something else. So even just another thought can be our form of multitasking. Thank you, Tara. Marcus, when we're discussing something personal, that's interesting, that it's not work-related professional things. You're good. You're tuned in. You're on point, not challenged. If it swoops into that personal arena, you find yourself more challenged to listen well. Thank you. When we're in an argument, when I have a lot to say myself, Kevin, that's kind of what I was thinking about when someone wrote, when I'm excited, like I was immediately imagining, oh, I've got so much to say. General information meetings. Thanks, Matt. Some of which you may just find maybe don't feel relevant to you. Angry, another stress when I'm in arguments, overwhelmed. Here we've got Kendall is in the house. Kendall Clavish and I have worked together for many years. It's so good to have you with us, Kendall. And when you're overwhelmed is when you cease to be a good listener. I hear that. And Christina said the same thing. It's that is the moment where we just start to shut those listening capacities down. When the speaker goes into too much detail or the topic just doesn't mean anything to me. Yes, absolutely. All right, so keep these challenging types of listening scenarios in mind and see if you get some tips today from me and Laura that you could apply and maybe make those challenging situations just a little bit easier for you. So let me introduce you to our guest today. Dr. Laura Janusik is a listening coach. She's a trainer, world recognized trainer. Her PhD is in communication with a specialization in listening. Did you know there were specializations in listening? Did you know there were listening coaches out there in the world? She is the CEO of a company called Listening to Change LLC. She served a term as the president of the International Listening Association, ILA. So Laura is just bringing us a wealth of information. She has coached me on listening. I've done a listening coaching session with Laura where I learned a lot. I'll tell you more about that as we get rolling here. But let me introduce you. Let's bring Laura in and welcome her to the show. Laura, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Brenda, my pleasure. I am so happy to be here. And it's funny that as a listening person, I love to talk about listening, but I do love to listen as well.
We listen through chat today, primarily. Don't you love our audience and how global they are?
Yes, absolutely. I feel like I'm at the International Listening Association.
Absolutely. I think that's an interesting piece. We hadn't really planned to talk about culture, but if we have a chance, I'd be really curious for our listeners to chime in with, as you've functioned professionally in intercultural situations, how do some of the listening dynamics change? If you've had some experience in that, since we do have such a beautifully global audience, it'd be great if you share some of those experiences in the chat with us, and Laura and I can circle back to that. But let me kick off first before we get into any specifics like that. Laura, I understand that your educational background was in communication, so having a listening specialization, that makes sense. I am so curious when and how you figured out that it's not just an academic exercise to study listening or to practice good listening yourself. How did you figure out that people needed listening coaches? How did you evolve your own intrigue of listening into listening coaching and training?
That's a great question. And first of all, Brenda, I will say that I was not a voluntary listener. I was probably the world's worst listener until I got into graduate school. And I was paired with Andrew Wolven as my advisor, who was a listening expert. And he just dropped the word listening for 2 years incessantly. And I kept telling him I was not going to become a listening person. And he was great. He said I could be anything I wanted. But then, Brenda, I realized he would be writing my letters of recommendation. So I signed up for his listening class. And within 2 weeks, it changed my life. I recognized that I had no idea what listening really was. I didn't understand that listening was a process. I didn't understand that the quality of listening determines the quality of the relationship.
Mm.
And I didn't realize there was so much to learn about listening. So it was purely accidental. But once I was hooked within those 2 weeks, I could never turn back. And I realized that the little things that I learned that I did for myself, so I could become a better listener and develop better personal and professional relationships, I could just give those quick little tips to other people. And they were like, oh my gosh, that totally changed my life. Such as the multitasking tip that you talked about. All of the research says that we can't multitask. So little things like turning off all of your notifications on your computer, and really focusing on the message that's coming in, just game changers for people.
Right, right. I love that idea that the quality of our listening determines the quality of our relationship. I'm holding on to that. That is, I think, so true and so underappreciated in our and in the US culture, North American culture specifically. I think that we value talking so much. We think that our leaders are the one that are vocalizing and verbalizing and writing and talking and speaking. And in reality, how can we even lead if we're not listening? So I really do appreciate that concept. Also thought it was interesting that you said, I learned, one of the first things you learned was that listening is a process. You know, we talk about the fact that listening is the least taught of all the communication skills. We have years of reading classes. We have years of writing classes. Most of us have even taken some sort of formal education or workshops around speaking, public speaking, or better communication, thinking of from the verbalizing or oral communication perspective. Very few people have had very much training, maybe an hour here or there, on listening. So here it is, our most used but least taught of all the communication skills. And I wonder if that's because physiologically we can hear. And so we're thinking, so we mistake hearing for listening, where those are vastly different. Listening's more of a process, as you said. What does that mean to you when you say listening's a process?
Yeah, listening. When I first, thought about being a listener before I was a listener, I thought it really was just about remembering things, and I had a fairly good memory, so I just assumed that I was a great listener. And I really appreciate that you brought up that distinction between hearing and listening, because I think that when we grow up, because most of us can hear, we just automatically assume that we can listen, but we don't recognize the process that's involved in listening. We have to first focus on the sound waves that are coming in. They have to go into our prefrontal cortex, which is right behind our forehead. We have to pull words from our long-term memory to match up with what we just heard. And that's why a lot of times we don't make meaning well, because we don't have those words stored in our long-term memory. So they just, go in one ear and out the other, so to speak. And so then you have to put all of those words together and figure out how you're going to respond. And it happens so quickly that we don't even recognize we're doing things like that until we start learning a second language. And when we start learning a second language, that's when that translation part becomes much more obvious to us, because we hear the word in the second language and we're searching our long-term memory going, pupitra, pupritra, what does that word mean, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it takes longer for a second language, but then we start understanding that process that's involved in listening. And I like to say that listening is really, it's a cognitive process, but within communication, it's perceived behaviorally. So you can't see my brain working now,
Right,
but
right.
you see my nonverbals,
Ah,
and you make assumptions about whether I'm listening well or not by my nonverbals.
yes.
But as you and I both know, and anyone who's ever gone to school, you can fake your nonverbals. You can try to look like you're
Mm.
really listening well, but you're really thinking about something else.
I think the opposite can happen. I remember an argument with my husband years ago. He was um, multitasking, which we know is not great, but it was pretty simple tasks. Like maybe he was buttering the toast or tying his shoes or something. And I'm telling a story, and he is giving me that, and I was like, you know what? I'll just come back when you can actually listen. And he goes, babe, I was listening. And I'm like, right. And he goes, no, here's what you said. And he paraphrased back or ran back exactly what I had said. So he was listening, but he didn't look like he was listening. And I remember saying then, and I would argue this to this day, if you don't look like you're listening, it does not count. So when you say it's the perception of, I could perceive you as being a good listener when you're not. I could perceive you as a bad listener when you're not. And I think that does, that would be one of my tips for being a good listener, is make sure that non-verbally you're communicating that you are being a good listener when you are. Obviously, to Laura's point, don't fake it. You can be looking like a good listener and not be, and that's not going to get you anywhere, because eventually it'll be obvious that you're not doing a good job of listening. But you can also actually be engaging in some listening but not show that nonverbal attentiveness, and people will assume you're not listening as well as you really are.
Yeah.
So look like a listener.
Well, but not all of the time, right? Because there are some individuals who can't have eye contact when they listen because it distracts them. So they don't look like good listeners, but they actually are processing everything that the speaker has said.
That is interesting.
So, figuring out what the other wants from you, I think, is really important.
Right. So if my other listener wants eye contact, but that's really hard for me for any variety of issues, neurodiversity, just not how I process best. Culturally, it feels inappropriate for me to make eye contact, whatever might lead me to not want to make eye contact. But I have a sense that that's what my conversational partner wants. What are some of the other ways that I could show someone or tell someone I am listening, even if non-verbally I may not look like the listener they expected?
That's a great question. And I think that that's where some of those really good listening skills come in, such as checkouts or reflecting what you just said, or mirroring, sometimes it's called. So I like to use what I call the keyword. And the keyword means that I listen to what you had to say and I pick out a keyword or a key phrase and I use it in my first response back to you. So it's kind of like the link of a chain. It shows you that I was listening and I'm responding on topic, even though I may not have been looking at you.
Interesting. Well, that is, I think, so important now that we are a more remote communicative culture, in that it's hard to make eye contact. You're never even exactly sure, is eye contact the camera? Is it the face? Is it over here? And so I think it's harder to communicate in an authentic way, in a nonverbal way, that I am listening. So that keyword chain makes so much sense for my virtual meetings. I'm definitely taking that one with me. Soha, you're going to have to tell us a little bit more in the chat about why you're pretending to be distracted when you're actually listening. We're going to need a little more information on that one, my friend. I think when you were backstage, Laura, could you see the challenges that people were typing in for us? They were giving us some of their listening challenges. Isn't that interesting?
I could. And a lot of them were related to emotion. And that is very difficult, particularly the negative emotions, right? So
stress,
when
anger.
and we don't like the person or we don't like the argument. And so trying to put that aside and be objective. And, that difference between understanding and agreeing. And a lot of people don't recognize that with listening. Just because we've listened to somebody doesn't mean we're taking on their perspective. It just means that we're understanding their perspective.
Yeah. Do you communicate that to people that may be confused about that?
Absolutely.
What's some of the language that you use when you're listening? Because I do catch myself like I catch myself being a good listener. Well, I mean, that seems like a good thing, but I'm nodding and I'm doing this because I'm listening, and then I realize, oh my gosh, you think I'm agreeing with you because I'm doing this, and I'm not. I'm not going there. I'm just trying to understand, and I'm nodding that I get you. I'm not. I'm not. I didn't mean to imply agreement.
Yeah.
So what's some of the languaging that you use to communicate that distinction?
Two things that pop to mind with that question. One is I might ask the question, are you open to a different perspective when it's my turn to speak? Because then I can let them know that I've understood what they said, but I see it differently. And then the other, oh, wow, it just flew out of my head. See, I was trying to hold two things active, and the second one just
A
went
point in
away.
case about how challenging that is. But I think that's a great point that I can say back to you, use some of those key phrases to create the chain so that you know I was listening, I'm hearing, and then to simply ask that question, are you open to another
Yeah.
perspective? And that clearly indicates without any kind of sort of animosity
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not agreeing here, and
Yeah.
I don't even have to say I'm not agreeing. And you remembered it, didn't
I
you?
did. I
I
did.
knew if I talked long enough, I'd find some time.
Yes, thank you for saving me on that one. Sometimes I just say I see things differently, um, or I disagree with you. I understand what you're saying, and I understand, this, and that. However, I see it this way, and so I can just say I see it differently. Or sometimes, depending on who the other person is, sometimes I will ask a question and say, "Well, that's all really interesting. Have you considered this point, or have you thought about that?" Because oftentimes they'll then think about that and go, oh yeah, I didn't take that into consideration at all. Or if they're really tied to their position, that doesn't matter.
Right.
And the research on being tied to our position is getting more and more interesting, because the more we are talking about a topic that we assume to be part of our identity, the less we listen objectively.
Give us an example. That is so interesting. So the more the more the topic is tied to my identity, the more I'm tied to my position.
Yeah.
The less willing I am to be open-minded or to hold my judgment lightly because
Yeah.
it's closely connected to my identity.
Right. And I will just say one word:
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah. Good enough. And we move on. There we go. I love it. I love it. Oh my goodness. So I'm curious. We spoke to some of that emotional piece that comes in and how challenging that is. By the way, I love how your phrasing for a disagreement is so non-confrontational or so non-adversarial. Are you open to another position or another opinion? Have you thought about X? I see things differently. None of those had anything that said you're wrong, I disagree. They were all so honest, and they definitely communicate the point clearly that I'm coming to this from a different perspective. That's where we started this, was like, how do I nod and listen and hear you, understand you, but not implicitly give you this idea that I agree. And I just think those phrases that you gave us are so incredibly helpful. Thank you for saying that. So certainly our listeners here today are finding those emotionally charged conversations. One of the times it's hard to communicate or to listen well. In your experience and research, what are other common challenges people experience when they're trying to listen? What are some of the listening obstacles that we have to jump over?
I think some of the most obvious barriers, but common barriers really, is that ability to focus. And when we think we can focus, that's when we do two things at once. And it's not that we can't multitask. So if you want to get into the details there. Multitasking is when we do two things that tap different parts of our brain, which is why your husband could process what you were saying and butter toast at the same time, right? Or I can walk and talk at the same time and generally not trip. However, when both tasks tap the same part of the brain, that's considered switch tasking, because we can't give 100% to either of them. We go back and forth. And when we go back and forth, we always lose time and we always make more mistakes. So if somebody walks into the office and starts talking to me and I'm on my computer, those are both language processing tasks. So I can't do two at once. I've got to give one up to give 100% attention.
Interesting. And just give it up. Make your choice. Either it's, I'm in the middle of something, I need to chat with, I need to come find you later and give up that person that just interrupted, or give up the whatever you're working on here, the email that you're crafting, or yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Good. Yeah. So focus is where you see one of the greatest challenges.
I think focus from that perspective of listening is primarily a cognitive activity.
Okay.
And then that other line, right? But it's perceived behaviorally in communication. And so we have to act like the good listener that the other perceives a good listener would act like, and trying to figure out what that is and customize it for people. And obviously, there are values and cultures that really help guide us there. In the United States culture, as you mentioned, eye contact is really important. Head nodding is really important for women, much more than men. Men tend to not do that anywhere near as much. But in other cultures, eye contact could be the height of disrespect.
Yes, absolutely. I leave for South Korea in the morning to teach for the rest of the month. And I had to train myself that that lack of eye contact didn't mean they're all tuned out, they're sleeping, they're bored. It had a very different and respectful kind of connotation to it. So yeah, teaching myself to perceive things a little bit differently. When Tatiana and I in our course, and when I talk about listening, I kind of break it down by these different types of listening. I talk about the different contexts in which we listen. I talk about the idea that sometimes the context calls for us to listen for details. If it's something I have to act on later, I'm going to need the details, the who, what, where, when, why. Sometimes I actually need to listen to evaluate. We were just talking about how sometimes we need to listen to understand, but there are contexts or situations where I'm going to be asked to make a decision, go or no go, yes, no, fund it, don't fund it, buy it, don't buy it. All of those, I actually need to kick into sort of this evaluative listening mode. Sometimes someone's getting into this sort of the personal conversations that one of our listeners talked about. They just need to express emotion, and the context, the situation calls for me to just listen empathetically, just listen for the feelings and purely to understand. And then I coach around different practice strategies for each of those different contexts. I know when you talk about listening in the coaching session that we did together, you talk about listening habits or listening types. And I'd be really curious for you to explain those 4 primary listening types to us, and how we might gauge which one of those is our dominant sort of listening approach or preference.
Oh, yes, I would be happy to. I love talking about the echo listening profile. It's probably some of the newer listening research. It was published in 2020. And we used to think of listening styles as being more of a trait as opposed to a state. So I always listen for details. That's just who I am. But through this research that was done, what we've recognized is listening is actually a habit. And what that means is we tend to do it the same way subconsciously. And if we never learn there are other ways to do it, we just don't do it a different way. Many of us, particularly people who study communication, but many other people too, figure out that there are different ways to listen in different contexts, like you said, because we not only have to look at the goal of why we're listening, but what we're going to do with that information as well. So the context involves a lot of things. So the context also should determine the listening habit we should use. What the research has found through ECHO is the 4 dominant listening habits are: first, you can be connective, which means that you take the words that are coming at you and you look for the ones that have to do with the people and the emotions and how the information might impact the people. So that would be a connective listener.
Let me hop in here for just a minute, Laura. Make sure you're getting this, listeners, because I'm going to give you a poll when she's done explaining all 4. I'll ask her to summarize them in a word or two once again, but I'm going to ask you to guess based on her description which one of these you are. So connective is one. Now here, listen to the other 3 and then decide which one you think is your dominant style based on Laura's descriptions. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And the second is reflective. And a reflective listener tries to take in everything and then processes it and compares it to prior experience. Not in a selfish way, but in a way to help. How am I going to add to this conversation? How can I help people understand what worked in the past and what didn't work in the past? And what's interesting is oftentimes people who use that habit don't have eye contact, because that's something that it's not needed to process to figure out the data. So they're almost, the reflective listener's habit is almost like being a computer processor. The third is analytical, and it's exactly as you would sound like. These are the individuals who are really interested in the data, the information, and the credibility that supports that data and information. And then the fourth is conceptual, and another word for conceptual would be the brainstormers of the group. Because what they're doing is they're listening for the big picture or the big idea. They don't care about the details. They're listening for the big idea, and then they're applying it towards the possibility of the future. How could we do it a little bit differently? Who could we partner with? So when you think about our brains as a strainer, we have 4 different strainers in our brains, and depending on which one we activate, and when we get educated in this, it's much easier to activate a different strainer, right? Because we're like, oh, I really should be listening analytically here, and I wasn't before. So again, we've got the connective, who is about the people and the emotions and how the information is going to impact people. We've got the reflective, the internal computer processor, trying to link it to past experience and knowledge. We've got analytical, the details, the information, and the credibility that supports them. And then we've got the conceptual strainer, which is just give me the big idea so I can apply it as possibilities in the future.
All right, so users, we're going to pull up a poll. There's a QR code or a slido.com with the number. Let's see where you land when you think about those 4 different styles that Laura just explained to you. And I love the metaphor, Laura, of the filter. Like, this is not just a trait. This is not, I am a connective listener and that's all I can ever be, but rather I'm using my connective listener filter because that's what this context or this conversational partner, it's what will make this the most effective conversation we can have, or the most productive conversation we can have. I love that idea. Users, while you're filling this out, by the way, I wanted to mention that when Laura did my coaching session, I took this ECHO assessment that she's mentioned, which has these 4 different ones. And first of all, my results were much more nuanced than just, one of these 4. It gave me a mapping of kind of the percentage, which, you know, and the interplay between these. And I think you used a term called co-dominant, didn't you, Laura?
Double dominance.
Double dominance, yeah. So that I had two that were both ranked highly enough that she called that a double dominance, and that meant I listen a little differently than if I just. So this little poll that you're filling out is definitely sort of an elementary look at the echo assessment. But I was also, as I was taking it, I feel a little arrogant confessing this, but I'm like, hey, you know, I've studied listening. I know myself pretty well. I'm pretty self-aware. I teach in this space. I'm pretty sure I can guess just by answering the questions which one of these is going to be my dominant area. And I was actually surprised. The results were not what I had anticipated. But when I read the description, when Laura talked me through what that meant, I was like, oh, yeah, that is definitely on point. Yeah, that is definitely on point. So it wasn't that I disagreed with the results. They were a surprise for me. And a surprise then that allowed me to start, like you said, I started being able to tap into different filters more appropriately. I know my analytical score was almost non-existent. And I was like, I know there are a myriad of situations in my daily activities, not just once a week, once a month, daily. I face situations that call for that analytical filter in my head. I've got to start tapping into it a little more because I'm missing some opportunities, I'm sure, by not using that space it very much. When you first took it, what were some of your lessons learned?
Well, actually,
if
you don't mind, I want to go back to you because I wanted to ask you if you tried that tip that I gave you about when you go into meetings, you write questions from an analytical place, and then you take those questions to the meeting with you and you have them in front of you, and then that automatically switches on that filter. And so you start listening for those. And when I coach teams, one of the things that I love to do, I always have them do that. But if their question was not answered, then I have them ask it. And I have seen teams totally change because, first of all, they whip around and they go, he just asked an analytical question. He never is concerned about the budget. You know, he's always the one talking about the emotions. What's this about? And then it causes people to really talk differently too, because one of the things, I'm not sure if we covered this or not, I like to call it the big three triangle. There's research that supports how we think, how we listen, and how we speak are all correlated, which makes perfect sense because what I'm saying out of my mouth was just in my mind. And that would be what I listen for as well. And so that's one of the ways that we can figure out which habit the other person is using because they're speaking from that habit.
Interesting. Okay, so tell us more. Okay, so first of all, we've got some of our users have polled in here. We've got a lot of our best guess without having taken the assessment. And like I said, you might be surprised, but at our best guess, we've got a lot of connective listeners, a lot of reflective listeners, and fewer, but still a good share here on analytical and conceptual. Good. So users, hopefully that was helpful to even start thinking about yourself as leaning in towards one of these more than the other. But remember, it's not a trait. That doesn't mean that's the only way you can listen. It just helps you sort of say, oh, this is where I tend to go. Is that appropriate for this conversation? If I don't hear anybody in our meeting tomorrow asking reflective types of questions, is that something I could bring to our team to enrich this conversation, which was just one of the most profound outcomes of my listening coaching session with Laura, was just asking these different related questions. But you had just commented on this really interesting idea that it's not just about knowing ourselves, it's about knowing our conversational partner and then sort of tailor to the audience. So how would I know if when I'm interacting with Laura, she's more connective or analytical? How would I know that? And what would I do to adapt?
Yeah. And that's a great question. And I don't know if you saw this comment in the chat earlier, but there was somebody who zoned out when people started talking in details,
Uh-huh.
and she said that that's what totally just bores her. Well, that means to me that she is not an analytical habit. She just does not, yeah, put that filter up a lot. So she's probably much more conceptual. And I think conceptual and analytical, though they're not direct opposites, I see a lot of disagreements between people in those positions. Um, so, so, oh gosh, Brenda, I'm so embarrassed. I
Well,
forgot the question.
it's interesting though. Because we also had someone commented that he gets or she gets uncomfortable with the personal
Mm-hmm.
kinds of conversations. So maybe that is someone who's more analytical. Like, give me all the details, give me the logic, give me the facts. But oh, you start in on that emotional stuff, and I just want to check out.
Yeah,
So just even
exactly.
identifying our own challenges might be
Mm-hmm.
one of the ways we start realizing that. So how do I know which
Yeah.
you are, and what do I do about it once I do know?
Yeah. And so, how do I know what my conversational partner is? That was your question. So, my conversational partner, if they're talking a lot of details, and you'll hear questions too. So, the questions about the details or the facts or who said this, then you're speaking with somebody who's using the analytical habit. If they are talking about emotions or asking extended, what we would call rapport building questions in the beginning, right? What did you do this weekend? We think of that as just, that's rapport building information. But if you're not connective, you don't like to share those details of your personal life. And so if somebody is asking about those things, then they are working from the connective filter.
Okay.
If somebody is talking about the future and all of the possibilities, then they're coming from the conceptual place. And then it's funny because reflective listeners oftentimes don't talk a lot. So oftentimes in meetings, the reflective listener will say nothing. And oh, Brenda, when I taught at Rockhurst University for almost 20 years, I'm really embarrassed to say that I did not know about these 4 listening habits at that time. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I used to do this all of the time. I figured I was teaching listening, so people had to look at me like good listeners. And so I would have those students who would be taking notes, who would be looking off in the distance and not looking at me. So then I would really try to engage that student, just to get them. And when I couldn't, I would get so frustrated and I would think that they were being so disrespectful. But yet they would come in the next class period and have a really well thought out question about what we discussed. They would get A's on the exams. And it just drove me crazy because they weren't connecting with me. But now I totally understand. So if any of my former students are on here and I did that to you, I apologize. My
She's
bad.
learned. We've evolved. We all grow. It's good.
Yeah.
So okay,
Yeah.
so those are some of the cues then that would.
Those are the cues. And then we can then start speaking that way. So the person who didn't like the details, right? Once she settles and goes, wait a minute, they're being very analytical. What detail can I respond with? Or what source can I respond with? Then you're speaking the other person's language. And it's almost like we talk about nonverbal mirroring often,
Yeah, you
right?
might
But
define that real quickly.
oh, so the nonverbal mirroring, if you put your hand on your chin like that, right, then I do that, and we find that we like people more when they're acting like us. Well, we find that we like people more when they're speaking like us too. And so trying to figure out how to use that mirroring effect. So I'm going to speak to somebody who's analytical. Once I've determined that, I'll speak in more detailed language to that person. If I find that that person is conceptual, I might say, yeah, the possibilities are really endless. What if we did this or what if we did that? If I'm speaking to somebody connective, and it's uncomfortable, I might have to slow down and maybe say a little bit about what I did over the weekend or how I feel about something. Or even, I haven't determined exactly how I feel about that yet. I'm still tossing it around, but you're using that feeling word. So it's connecting a little bit to that link. And then for reflective people, oftentimes what I will do with reflective listeners is I will ask them a question based on their past. So I will say something like, Brenda, it looks like you're really thinking about this. I suspect you have an experience in your past that's similar to this. Can you tell us about that? And then they're able to join the conversation comfortably because it's about their past.
And that's where their brain has been focusing anyway. I love that. Right now, of course, in the business literature and culture, we're hearing so much about authenticity. Authenticity. You got to be yourself. You've got to be true to yourself. And I think that it's a good moment here, maybe, to pause and say that when we tailor, maybe I am a more reflective listener, but if I am stepping into a more analytical voice, I don't think that makes me inauthentic. I think it just means I'm tailoring to my audience. It's almost as if we speak two different languages and I'm opting to switch into your mother, your first language, which is a courtesy, which is just a way of connecting. Otherwise, how would we communicate if I'm not even speaking in a language that you understand? So I hope people think of this as being bi-tri or quadlingual rather than as being inauthentic. Does that make sense?
It does. And I really love the analogy that you just used, Brenda. So you're going to Korea, correct?
Right.
And I'm assuming you've learned a little bit of Korean?
My 20 courtesy phrases so that I'm not the rude American, hopefully.
Yes, exactly. And I'm going to Germany on Thursday myself. So trying to use a little bit of German. I can't expect them to all speak English. Why would I expect them to be bilingual if I'm not bilingual?
Right.
And so meeting people where they are in a way that they can understand us, because we really want to be heard and understood, right? That's ultimately what we're trying to do when we communicate. And we have to adapt ourselves to the other. So I think that really speaking from different listening preferences or listening habits doesn't mean that we're inauthentic at all. I think it really means that we're trying to make that connection.
Yes, absolutely. We skimmed over an exercise that you gave me that was just so transformative. So I want every coach or trainer or educator or just individuals that are on the call to hear this exercise. I always try to give one very concrete exercise, and Laura shared one with me that was just so impactful to my approach to listening. So could you walk us through that questions exercise one last time?
And was it asking questions from the different perspective?
Yes.
So when you do the echo listening profile, one of the things that I provide then is this list of questions from different perspectives. And what I challenged Brenda to do, since analytical was not her forte at all, I challenged her to write down, to get the agenda for the next meeting she was going into, looking for anything, any topic that would be analytical, and jotting down 3 or 4 questions from an analytical place, and then going to the meeting with those questions ready to ask. And I hope you did that.
I did. And in fact, the first time I did it, I don't even want to confess how long it took me to come up with 3 questions from that analytical mode, because it was just so counterintuitive to me. It just wasn't how I thought. So I kept writing a question and I'm like, no, that's actually connective. Okay, let me try again. No, that's actually conceptual. Okay, let me try again. So, 10 minutes in, I had my 3 questions, but even that has become much easier for me, that now I can grab an agenda and I can pop out 3 analytical questions in a heartbeat. So I know that I'm growing that muscle, which has been really good for me. And to your point, to watch people's reactions in the meeting when Brenda asked an analytical question that they're so not used to me asking, that was great fun. Like, oh, wait, who? who are you? But and I have a lot of analytical team members, so it's not as maybe as necessary as it would be for some teams. What I've really enjoyed doing is listening to the arc of the conversation and tracking questions throughout. And for the first few meetings, I would even make little CRA or CO comments on my agenda as I heard questions, and then tick marks beside them. And when there were meetings where I realized no one is tapping into past experience, and yet I know the collective wisdom in this room is tremendous, I would make sure to say, well, what do we know from our own experience? What happened last semester? What happened 10 years ago? Like really tapping that, or whichever one of the categories I saw missing. And I do think it enriched the conversations in a different way.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely brilliant that you kept track of that. When I work with teams, one of the things that I challenge teams to do is take the last 5 to 10 minutes of a meeting and really go around the listening habits and asking questions from each of those, because oftentimes teams will be very dominant in one or two areas, but really have biases and not include those other areas. And you know darn well that when a team makes a decision, they're going to get impacted by the people that they didn't consider.
Yes.
And so it's a really good exercise to go, okay, what pushback are we going to get? And how can we reframe this that includes that perspective as well?
Oh, I love that. Our team missing this perspective, but we're going to get hit with it when this goes up a level to be voted on or considered elsewhere. I love that. That's awesome. Laura, if our viewers want more about Laura, where do they find you? What resources should they tap into? I've already mentioned that Tatiana Kolovu and I have a LinkedIn course on listening in the effective listening in the workplace. We encourage you to take a peek at that. But Laura, if they want to follow up with you, what's the best way to be in connection with you?
Yeah, we'll take Brenda's course first, of course, because this is hers, which I've taken it. So thank you very much. I love it. But if you would like to get in touch with me, my website, Listening to Change, with the two being TO, listeningtochange.com. There is a place in there where you can send me a message, or I love to link on LinkedIn. And so if you just say in the message, saw you on Brenda's show this morning, I will automatically connect with you there. I'll also be sending you two other links, Brenda. One will be to get on my mailing list because I send out a listening tip or communication tip of the week. And then the other will be if you're interested in taking the Echo listening profile. I can send you the information on how to do that. And I will be the person who is debriefing it with you for a full hour. So that's just always a lot of fun.
So those links will appear in this post. So always just come back to my LinkedIn site or Laura's LinkedIn site to find this show with the links in the, we'll try to tag them so that they stay up. We want her. She is great. I know, right? The best listening expert we could have on the show. Next month, you're in for another treat. We have C. Nicholson on August 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. C is, along with what is called the Band of Sisterhood, has written an amazing book called You Should Smile More, sort of a facetious title there, how to dismantle gender bias in the workplace. Men, women, all of us need to understand gender bias and how we can make it go away in the workplace. We will all benefit from that, and you're going to love C. Laura, thank you for all of your tips on listening, for the resources for us to be able to follow up with you. Listeners, I hope you learned some tips that you will go out and apply immediately to your listening so that you, like I, can see some tremendous changes in those meetings and those conversations that you're having. Thanks you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Brenda. As I like to say, teaching the world to listen one person at a time.
Absolutely. Take care.